Also, the family speakers of our two previous lectures, Dhruv and Varun, will be felicitated by the ambassador on the next lecture. Shri Sanjeev Sanyal is not only a renowned historian and an economist, but also the author of many best-selling books. In the upcoming segment, Ms. Anisha Barki, representing Oman Book Lovers Club, will interview Shri Sanjeev Sanyal.
Good evening, everyone. His Excellency Shri Amit Naran, Ambassador of India to the Sultanate of Oman, Mrs. Divya Naran, spouse of the Ambassador, our esteemed Speaker Dr. Sanjeev Sanyal, distinguished guests from the Omani and Indian communities. I'm deeply grateful to the Indian Embassy, Amit sir and Divya ma'am, for this opportunity, incredible opportunity. I'm really honored to be here today representing Oman Book Lovers Club. A very brief introduction. Oman Book Lovers Club is a community platform founded for the sheer love of books, growing through the love and support of the community. In 2 years' time, OBLC connects 15,000 plus members through our 13 segments and activities for all age groups and all kinds of readers. I'll go join Mr. Dr. Sanjeev. Thank you so much.
By the way, just call me Sanjeev. I'm beginning to feel like an old dignitary.
That's right.
So, first of all, thank you so much for your enlightening lecture. Very interesting to know about these topics, the history that connects the Indian Ocean and the land marks involved. So, as Oman Book Lovers Club, we are here to focus on your books and your journey as an author. So, I'd just like to talk about briefly about your books. If you could tell us briefly about all the books that you've written, just an introduction, and your journey as an author. What inspired you to take to writing and publishing your books?
So, thank you very much, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about life as an author, because I mostly spend my time as an economist. Let me say that if you had ever met me when I was 18, the last thing you would have imagined is that I was going to become an author, and that also writing books on history. Because I'm what is called would be called a science maths type. So at 18, I ended up being in economics, but I could have ended up in the sciences either. So by some random choice that I made at 18, I ended up as an economist. But even there, economics is has mostly about statistics and those kinds of subjects. So it's not a very literary subject, let's say. So I don't think I ended up being a writer because I was particularly interested in literature or history. I had a general interest in history like many other people have, but I don't think anybody, myself or my teachers or my parents, would have thought that I would actually end up writing. So my writing, when I did begin to write, was really as an economist, writing, I'm sorry to say, very boring things, financial market reports. So that's what I began writing, and I would write articles in the newspapers. Even in college I used to do that. So it's only somewhere in my 30s that I began to think of writing something other than economic reports. In fact, even today, by the way, the bulk of my writings are economic reports. They're mostly not in my name because I write, they are published in the name of the government of India, the economic survey and so on. So they may bear my name somewhere in there, but it doesn't get published in my name. But my journey as a writer started by accident, and I'll tell you how. So at that time, I was living in Singapore, working for a bank called Deutsche Bank. I was the chief economist for Asia, Southeast Asia at that time. It was early 2000s, 2002, 2003, somewhere in that time zone. And at that time, for no reason at all, one fine afternoon, I decided to write a short story. And then I'm not quite sure why, over the next few months, I wrote a whole bunch of those short stories.
What was this short story about?
So I don't quite remember. I think they're in one of my books. It's if I have one of my short story books here, it's called Life Over Two Beers. So it's a short story there. I think it was the one which is a short story called Lake, The Bench by the Lake. So anyway, read this. It's a short story about the bench by the lake. And then I wrote a whole bunch of these short stories. So having written a bunch of these short stories, I then thought that it must be worth publishing it. So I knew a friend who knew a friend and so on who knew some publishers. So I went to various publishers and all of them refused to publish it. It turns out that the single most difficult thing to publish is actually poetry, followed by short stories. Because evidently there are thousands of people who think they are great poets and short story writers, and so publishers are inundated with requests to publish poetry and short stories, and evidently nobody buys them. So net result is publishers basically refuse to publish these two categories of books. So nevertheless, I persisted. So by this time, we have reached 2006, and nobody had agreed to publish these short stories. So anyway, I was doing it anyway for the fun of it. So finally, when I reached Penguin, they looked at me and said, "Look, you by this point I had become somewhat well known as an economist." They said that we don't want to publish your short stories, but we will publish a book by you on any economic issue that we were willing to publish. So at that time, India was still not a very well-known upcoming story as an economy. But I wrote this book. This is actually my first published book, which is called The Indian Renaissance. It says, The Indian Renaissance, India's Rise After 1,000 Years of Decline. Now remember, this is 2000, by the time I published it, it was 2007. This is still not a very popular subject, so to speak. So I wrote this book, and for whatever reason, it became a bestseller. So that is how I ended up becoming a writer. And then in 2008, by this point, I was covering large parts of Asia for Deutsche Bank. I got up one morning and I decided I just couldn't write any more financial markets reports anymore. So I just resigned without telling my wife. She was quite annoyed about the whole thing. And so I moved back to India and went traveling around India with my two boys. By that time, I had two kids. They were quite young. And so I traveled around India for 2 years and went to various places. And the result of those travels was a book called The Land of Seven Rivers, which is the one here. It's a history of India from the perspective of its geography. So it's a history of India's geography. So histories are usually written with, this dynasty came, that dynasty came, those kinds of histories. This is in terms of how cities rose and fell, how India's climate changed, how its landscape changed, how migrations happened, and so on. So this is my second book. Then I got bored with retirement and went back to working for Deutsche Bank in 2011. And while doing that, I decided I'll write a book about the history of the Indian Ocean. Because remember, I had worked before that in Mumbai, I was born in Kolkata, and then I was working in Singapore, as I told you. So I lived in and around the Indian Ocean, and nobody could show me a good book about the history of the Indian Ocean. So I decided to write this book then, called The Ocean of Churn. And as a part of this research, in 2013 or 14, I actually came to Oman for 2 weeks and drove all along the coast. I went to Sur, I spent time in Muscat. I also went inland to 2013 or 14, I forget, to Nizwa and various mountains there and so on. So I had a great time doing that. And that, both this Land of Seven Rivers and the Ocean of Churn, both of them became massive bestsellers. In fact, both of them are among the highest selling history books in India, even today, after many years. Now that I had three best-selling books, finally Penguin agreed to publish Life Over 2 Years, which is my collection of short stories, which is what I actually originally set out to do. So going back to the point I was making about your question, my original purpose of starting to write was to publish these short stories. I managed to do this after having become a fairly well-known and in fact one of Penguin's biggest non-fiction writers. Then they agreed to publish short stories. So the moral of the story is, if you want to publish short stories, please publish something else first.
The highlight of today's lecture is the Ocean of Churn. Tell us a little bit more about it. You already mentioned it in your first answer, but a little bit more about how you researched apart from Oman travel. What else did you do?
So one of the things anybody who reads my books will realize, I visit something like 80-90% of the places I write about. Now this is important to me because you see, in the old days, you spent a lot of time in the archives and all kinds of other things. But I am a writer only of the last 15 years, which is the post-internet age. And a very large part of the archives are online. So I don't have to go and spend like an earlier generation in some library dusting books. If I like a book, I buy it on Amazon, or I find some pirated PDF if I can't. Or there's a huge amount of information which is digitized by various archives, museums, families, all. So, while once in a rare while you may actually have to go and dig in an archive, etc., good proportion of the information is available on Google, if you know how to mine it. So, what is the value add I'm bringing? So, I actually prefer to visit the places that I write about. And I discovered that gives a really unique perspective, because first of all, travel has become a lot more easier than it would have been in the past. Secondly, you see, much of what is written does not make sense unless you actually visit the places. So, for example, if you are reading the writings of some ancient or even medieval traveler, he may say that I went here and then I turned left and I did this and then. A person who is only reading archives will not understand there is some importance of the fact that he turned left as opposed to turn right. And it's only when you go there and you turn left at that point, you realize, yes, this makes sense. If he had turned right, he would have said something else. And I find this is quite important. When you go to a place, you get all this flavor. Like, for example, today I found out this amazing information about this song. I'm really going to pursue this, by the way. I'm a bad singer, so don't ask me to do it when singing it, but I'll try and get somebody more talented than myself to do it. But these are the kinds of nuggets you get. For example, I find out that fish oil is actually sardine oil. Now I will make sure it's sardine oil, not German. And so on and so forth. As part of this travel, you really get a flavor of many of these things. And by the way, this story of Narottam also is totally not there in any Indian literature. It happened to be that I was here, and the Kimji family was very kind to invite me into their homes, and they also arranged for, I forget the lady's name, who was a researcher who was working with, who was there, I think she was a British lady, who told me about this, and then I found it, once I was looking for it, I found it in other. Because once I knew what I was looking for, I did find references to it. But this story of Narottam I found quite fascinating. Because it's a story of an Indian in Oman who did something which changed history. But again, nobody in India had any clue about it. By the way, I have similar things even in the other parts of the world. So just like I came to Oman, I drove down the coast of India on the east side and up the west coast. So down the Kerala coast, up the Tamil coast. I went all along the Kerala, the Odisha coast. I went to Gujarat, similar for this book. See, I did it over time. It's not like I'm researching for a book, and my income doesn't depend on it. So what I do is, I wait for the next holiday. Then you can travel anywhere. So, you can go to Angkor Wat. So I went to Angkor Wat. I went to see Borobudur in Bali. I went to Vietnam. These are nice places to visit anyway. But if you go there with a certain purpose and you've researched the texts and so on, then when you arrive there, you're looking for, and it begins to make sense in a different sort of way. So along the way, I found many such interesting things and interesting experiences. But by the way, when you're traveling like this, I take it as it goes. So if there is a good 5-star hotel in that location, I definitely go and stay in the best location. But at some times, you end up living in a tent, or you end up living in strange places. Like in Rameshwaram, I found an old abandoned bungalow of a British era steamship company that used to function between India and Sri Lanka, of a company called Bison, the British India Steamship Company, Bison, whatever the acronym was. And there was this abandoned old bungalow, which an old couple was still living there. And so I went and stayed there sort of on this ramshackle old bungalow this was the New Year's of 2013 to 14, which I spent in this old bungalow. So I've had many fun experiences doing these kinds of things.
Traveled a lot.
Yes.
For this book.
Yes.
How long did it take to write this?
5 years. But I wasn't writing for 5 years. I was researching and collecting material. See, as I said, one advantage is that I'm not trying to make a living from it. Before I joined government in 2015, while I was writing this book, I thought, hey, there was this great famous voyage of Thor, who did it between Easter Island and Peru on a raft. Kontiki expedition. Yeah, the Kontiki expedition. So at some point I said, hey, this Kontiki sounds like a good. Why hasn't no Indian done this? So I had it at the back of my mind somewhere. Then I joined government, so I wrote a 3-page proposal. Then that proposal went nowhere. Then at some point I was presenting something to the Prime Minister about something totally different, and I mentioned this. He mentioned that there had been a reed boat attempt from Oman to Gujarat when he had been chief minister, and that boat had sunk.
Yes, 2005.
2005. So he said that had happened. So then, things got going, and then at some point in time, the Prime Minister Modi then gifted me, because I showed interest in the subject. He had found a 14th century manual for navigating in Kachi, old Kachi, medieval Kachi, for navigating these oceans, which had instructions of how to use the stars to navigate. So he had got it translated into English. So he gave me his copy, which is the one I'm talking about. I still haven't figured out how to use it. But the point is, as things got along, I then began to put more and more flesh on this proposal, and finally the Ministry of Culture showed an interest in it, and then the Navy said, yeah, this is a great idea, we'll help you do it. And then, lo and behold, at some point in 23, it became a reality. And now I'm actually building that ship.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and by the way, along the way, I discovered the Jewel of Muscat project as well. So, that was...
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot for sharing your input, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you today. Thank
Pleasure
you.
to talk to you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Anisha. We also have Professor Ismail Sajjali with us, who is also a key contributor in our Manvi to Muscat series. He will also be taking a lecture for us sometime in April, early April. As we draw towards the conclusion of our formalities, join us for refreshments outside. Once again, I extend my heartfelt welcome and thank you to each and every one of you who joined us this evening. May I now request members of Oman Book Lovers Club to come to the stage and collect their signed copy of Sanjeev Sir's book.